Okay, hello guys, and welcome to this newest episode of Vaadin webinars. In tonight's episode, we're going to look at field groups, and with me today I have Kim.
Hi.
My name is Fredrik, and Kim will walk us through basically how to use field groups to bind data, and more particular, as you know, the Vaadin data model being items and properties, how to bind the properties into fields. And then a little bit about how to show or change the default validation behavior, how to add validators and so forth.
Yeah.
So that's the agenda for today. At the end of the day, what you want to do or what we're going to do is this. So we want to build a form of some kind. So we'll start with small examples and then work more into more difficult examples and so forth.
Yeah, so this webinar is going to be highly technical and it's mostly going to be live coding.
Yes, but it's a good introduction to people who don't know Vaadin that well as well, because it covers the essentials of how to build forms as well, which is a central part in many applications.
Yeah, that's correct. Okay, so let's jump right into the first demo. So what field group is all about is basically what forms used to be in Vaadin 6. So it's a way how we can combine fields into a logical whole that belong together. So basically a web form. And I'm going to start by showing you a simple example of how to build a simple field group or a form using the field group. So I prepared a simple Bojo, a person bean, that has a number of different fields. So this one has, say, first name, last name, email, title, and an address, and the address is another Bojo that contains a street, zip, and city. And as you may have noticed, I'm also using bean validation in this bean. And
that was actually a question posted by quite a few of you when signing up. So your question was how to use bean validation, or more specifically JSR 303 together with field groups, or how to do the validation on the client side as well.
Yeah, so basically here now we have the validation defined in the bean itself, and if you're using JPA, this validation will be done on the backend side. But what I'm going to show you here is how to use these same validations so that we get them also on the UI layer.
Basically defining your validations in one place and having it checked in the UI layer as well as the JPA layer.
Yeah, that's correct. So let's start coding then. So here I have a really simple Vaadin application. It just has a vertical layout, and that's all the UI stuff that we have so far. And I've also prepared a person bean with some content. So this is John Smith and then his address. And now I want to create a form for actually showing and editing this data. So let's open up a little bit. So first I'm going to create a new class. I'm going to call this person form. And I'm going to extend a grid layout. And I'm going to make it a 2x4 grid. So what I'm now doing is that I'm going to explicitly define how the form should look like when I want to edit this person bean.
So this is basic Vaadin UI coding. You define the user interface and you don't concern yourself with where the data comes from, anything at all yet.
Exactly. This is just presentation. This is not yet anything about data binding itself. So let's start defining some kind of fields here. So I'll create a text field. I'll call it first name. Last name, I'll make a number of different fields. And let's take...
This is probably something typical that you all have in your applications, or people evaluating Vaadin as well. You probably want to show some forms of data and you want to have people input data into the forms as well. So.
Yeah. And let's also create a few text fields for the address itself and or street and a couple of more text fields, and then we are ready to go. City. So now I've defined a number of fields, and then I'll just add them to the layout just as I would be doing in any other Vaadin layouting situation.
Yeah.
So add component first name, add component last name, add component email, and let's make it so that it wraps a little bit, and then add component street. Actually, let's make it like add component zip and add component city.
And this is basic stuff. This is stuff you could even do with the Vaadin visual editor to just lay out fields on the canvas.
Exactly. So let's start by creating an instance of the person form. Layout, add component form. Now let's deploy this and see how this looks like. So now I have a really simple form here, and let's make a little bit modifications so that it looks a little bit better. So email set width to 100% and street set width to 100% as well. So now we have created the actual layout for the field, and then let's get to the meat.
Yes.
How we actually bind the data here to this layout. And for that we're going to use the field group. And I'll call it a binder because it actually binds data to a field. So unlike in Vaadin 6 where form itself was a component, field group is not a component. It's just basically a utility for binding properties into fields.
Yes.
Now, what the field group takes as an argument is an item. So I'll next create a bean item out of the person object. And then I'll just tell the field group that set item data source item. And then now I basically linked the data model to binder, and now what I need to do is also link the actual layout. So I'll call binder bind member fields, and then as an argument I'll give the layout.
So there's basically two things with the field group, binding the data itself and binding the form itself.
Exactly. So let's see if this works. So now you can see that there are some of the fields actually bound here. So let's zoom in a little bit so that you can see.
Yeah.
So now we can see that the first name, last name and email address, they were bound, but the street, zip and city are still unbound. And that's because they are not actually in the person object, they are in the address object that the person object has a reference to. So what we can do is tell the bean item that, hey, there are some nested properties I also want to access. Now, how we have now been able to actually link these fields into the properties is by convention. So if we actually take a look at the person form itself, we can see that the fields that I've defined here, they have been named exactly the same way as I've named the fields in the Bojo itself. So this is by convention. Vaadin will link these two together. But now I have the street and zip and city. they don't exist in the person, so they exist in the address. So now I need to have a way to actually link the street zip and city to the address. So what I'll do is add a property ID annotation.
So basically this is a much safer way to link them together as well, because now if somebody comes and changes the name of the street object itself, it doesn't sort of break the linking itself.
Yeah. Or if I change just the field here, then it doesn't matter. This field can be named any way I want.
Exactly.
But we are basically coupling this annotation to the names in the beans themselves.
Yes.
So now with these property ID annotations, we should be able to actually get those other fields linked here as well. So now we can see that these are linked. And this is basically the basic usage of a field group. So you make some kind of a layout, you define fields, you define the property IDs which we want to link to these, and then we use the field group, give it an item, and then bind these two together.
Yeah.
And now we probably want to do something else as well. So let's add a new button here.
So we want to get the changes we make back into the JPA layer as well.
Yeah. So let's create a save button and add a click listener there. And let's make it actually so that we are able to access the binder from within this method. So when the button is clicked, we'll call commit. So let's see. And now we should have the button visible. Yeah. Okay. Now validation. How do we actually want to apply some validation here? So as I showed in the beginning, we have some bean validation annotations defined here in the person bean. So let's use those or take those annotations and use them to build our validation in the Vaadin form.
And remember, this is just standard JSR stuff, so there's nothing Vaadin specific about the annotations.
Yeah. And so adding bean validation is just the same as adding any other validator. So I'll take the first name field and call add a validator, and then call add a new bean validator. And the bean validator takes as an argument the class object and the field name. And then let's also add last name, email, and like that. So let's see. Now you can see that the validation is working. We have defined that the first name must be between 1 and 10 characters. Okay, that's not a realistic validation, but just to give you an idea. And when I clicked on save, okay.
Specifically in Finland, where people have very long names, 10 characters is far too less.
Yeah, so now we can see that, okay, the validation error is shown here in the UI. Now, there was one question that came up quite a few times.
Yeah, many people actually asked about why, when you create your field group, why does the validation errors, why do they come up immediately when you start it up?
Yeah, so I'll show you what it's all about. So instead of using these predefined beans, let's create a new empty bean. Set address, new address, like this. So now you should see that, okay, we have these 3 fields as invalid by default, and that's probably something that we don't want to have in the beginning. So for example, if we're adding some new data, of course it will not be containing valid data
until you add it there.
Yeah, until you actually add it there. So the question is that how do we actually get rid of these errors until we actually commit the changes.
Yeah. On the other hand, it might come handy if you have erroneous data in the database and you show it here. So it's nice to show that as well. So it depends on your use case if you want to
exactly.
have it shown in the beginning or not.
So the Vaadin 6 form, it had a feature that allowed you to say that, hey, don't show the validation errors until the first commit. But the FieldGroup doesn't have that feature at the moment. There is an enhancement ticket about this, but it hasn't yet been implemented. But I'll show you how you can do this manually. Yeah. So the key here is that when is the validation actually done? And the validation is done when we change the value of the field. And then you can also explicitly call on validation, and then if you call commit on a field, then validation is also applied. Yeah. But in this case, the validation is applied because we have changed the value of the fields. In this case, the value changes when we bind the properties to the field. And when we bind the property to the field will take its value from the property, and hence the value changes and validation is applied. Now, what we need to do in this case is first disable these validation messages. So let's do that then. So let's take first name, set validation visible false. Last name, set validation visible false, and email, set validation visible false. Now when I load the data, you can see that, okay, there are no validation failures. But it also means that if I now click on save, hot deployment is causing those session expirations. Yeah. Okay, so now when I save, you can notice that I still don't see any validation messages. Yeah. And that's because I disabled completely those validation messages. So what I need to do is explicitly tell that, okay, now when the save button is clicked, we will enable again the validation messages. So let's create a new method. And nope.
Some of your private YouTube links.
Yes. Okay, so now let's see what happens.
Yes.
So now when we click on save, we re-enable those validation messages, and now we can see the validation errors. Some of you may be wondering, why is there the null text? We can get rid of those by saying set null representation, and give an empty string. So now we can see that the email address is empty instead of the text null.
Yeah.
So this is the basic usage of validators and FieldGroup. Now, this is the way that I like to do use FieldGroup, so that I explicitly define the layout which I'm going to use. Because then I have separated basically data binding and layouting. But this is not always something that we can do. We have use cases where we need to dynamically create the layout. Yeah. And we can actually do that with FieldGroup as well. So instead of calling bind member fields and giving the form there, what we can do is have the FieldGroup create the fields for us. So
we won't have as much control of what it looks like, but it's cases where data is where we don't know what data we're going to present in the form.
Well, it depends how you implement it. You can get full control of it. Let's see.
Yeah.
So what we can do is call build and bind, and then give some kind of a property ID as an argument. And what this will do is that the FieldGroup will create a new field for us. What it actually does is that it takes a look at the type of property that we have. So in this case, the first name is a string, and the field group has a field group field factory, and there we decide that, okay, for strings we want to have a text field. Yeah. So this will actually be a text field. And now I can add this to my layout. So let's see. Did deployment fail? Okay. Oh no, I have a compilation error. No wonder it didn't deploy. Okay, let's try again. So now we created a first name, and let's take the empty bean away so it's more apparent how the data binding works. So now it has bound the first name property into this field. Yeah. And this field was now dynamically created. We don't at this point actually know anything about what type of a field is returned. But we can create our own field group field factory and there define that, okay, for dates we create date fields, for strings we create text fields, and so on. Yeah. But the limitation with the API in the field group field factory at this point, or I'm not sure if it's a limitation, it's a design decision, that it doesn't know the property ID for which we are creating a field. It just knows the type. So in this case, let's say that we want to create something else. We want to create a native select, for example, for the title. The title is also a string, so here we can see we have the title, it's a string, but what if we want to create a native select for that one instead? So what we can do is create the field native select, create the field manually, and they'll tell the binder that bind this select to a particular property, so like this, and then layout add component. So now we have a native select here. Of course it looks a bit weird because it doesn't have any content. Yeah. But it could also be a text field. And let's deploy it. And now we have bound the title to the text field. Yep. Or it will take last name, which actually has a value. Yeah. Then we can see that, okay, it was already bound here. Yeah. So using build and bind methods, we can create dynamic forms. So we could have something like item get property IDs and then do a loop. Something like this.
And I guess we could have a look at the annotations for each of those as well and make decisions based on that.
In this case, we are not using the property ID annotations at all, because those were in the person form layout. Right. And now we are not using the layout any longer. So now I loop through the properties in the item and then just create a field for each of the properties. And now I have some kind of a demo effect. Okay, yeah, it's missing a converter. So let's, if proper address equals property ID, then let's not add it at all. So let's only apply this for the other fields. So now it should work. So now I have dynamically created fields for everything, including the nested properties. Yeah. So this is a way how we can actually create dynamic forms. I recommend that if you know the data structure, if you know actually what kind of properties there are, if you know how the form actually is going to look like, don't use this. Rather, be explicit and create the layout separately and then just doing binding. Separation of concerns.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, was again the basic usage.
Yes.
Another use case, and I think we could now move on to some more advanced questions.
Yeah, and you have a nice example as well coming up.
Yeah. So I travel around the world and have these Vaadin trainings, and in Vaadin Fundamentals course we go through the usage of FieldGroup, and there's a few questions that I'm asked quite frequently. I'm asked that, okay, how do I do multi-page forms? How do I do CrossField validation?
Yeah.
And how do I customize how these error messages are shown?
Yeah.
So I'm actually going to show you an example of how to do all of those three things.
I actually think multi-page forms is something quite many people actually need, because you want to have one POJO on the one hand, and you want to probably separate it in different views or different forms in the UI.
Yeah.
So
I'm going to show
looking
you
forward onto how that's going to look like.
Yeah, I'm going to show you a real example, and this is a complete Vaadin application. It's a simple demo application that I prepared, but it's complete. It uses Spring Boot, so it also has a JPA backend, and we are actually reading this data from a database, and when we make some modifications, we actually write the data to a database.
Yeah. So a real life example, not the kind of dummy data that we just create on the fly here.
So this is now a more advanced example. So this is an address book. I have listed a number of contact details.
Yeah.
And when I select a contact detail, I am shown with a form where I can edit the person's details.
Yeah.
And this POJO is exactly or almost exactly the same as we had in the previous example. I've added also one reference to skills, so we can define basic details: first name, last name, email, title. Then we had an address, and then we also have skills.
Yeah.
And this is one bean that is divided into 3 different layouts.
Yes.
So basically, the case is that we could put everything on one page, but the page would get quite busy. There's too much data visible at one time. So let's focus the content. Let's just put what we need on one page and then have multiple pages for different kind of data.
Yeah, and another use case could be a wizard kind of widget where you move from one page to another one and do the validation at the end as well, for instance.
Exactly. So in this case, you can jump between the tabs, but you could create a wizard using the same logic.
Yeah.
So how this is actually implemented is that we have 3 different layouts. I have one layout that defines the basic details. So here I have my text fields for first name, last name, email, and a combo box for the title. I also have a skills form which defines a twin call select. And then I have my address form which defines the layout for showing the address. Now,
and I can see here that you're not relying on convention, you're basically doing it through property IDs directly.
Yeah, I am. So, when I actually want to use these layouts in my view, I have here, for example, that when I do a selection in this table here, I get a value change event. From the table's container, I get the item that has been selected. I have my field group. I set the item as the item data source to the field group, and then I call bind the member fields with all the 3 layouts that I have defined.
And that's really nice. You don't have to bind specific parts of the data source into specific forms. You bind the same data into all the forms. They actually do the hooking of the data.
Yeah, so what the field group does is that it sees that, okay, this address form, it doesn't have anything else than the street, the zip, and city. So it will bind these 3 properties to this layout. And then the basic details, it has the first name, last name, email, title.
Exactly.
So the field group will bind those properties to this layout. So it's extremely simple to do these tabbed forms with the field group. So that's basically how you use a field group to do multi-page forms.
And the second question was about validation, how to show different types of validation.
Yes. So normally the validation error, it's shown here with the error indicator, and when you put your cursor over it, it will show you the actual validation message. But that's not necessarily how we want to show the data. What we actually might want to do is instead highlight the fields in some way, or then, for example, show the validation message somewhere else. So we might want to have a label somewhere that contains all the validation messages.
And perhaps a red notification in the middle of the screen saying that.
Something like that. So I prepared an example that shows you how you can customize these validation messages. So let's say that we put an invalid value here for the first name. Again, I specify that the max length is 10 characters.
And it's true to be in validation again, so.
It's true being validation again. So when I click on save, you see that we are not actually seeing the error indicator. Rather, there is a red border around this field. And same thing if okay, let's remove the value from here. We get a red border here. And let's put valid values here. Okay. And let's again add some invalid value. Let's change the tab and make some modifications here and click on save. Now, if you pay attention to the first tab, I've added an indicator here that will show that, hey, there's something wrong in this tab. The save didn't go through because there was some kind of an error. And
usability-wise, it would be probably nice to have a red indicator somewhere as well. But
this is
just a,
for example, an icon. So this is just a simple example of usability that, hey, okay, highlight that there's something wrong in this tab. So I've added this indicator that, hey, there's something wrong. And now let's take a look at how this is actually implemented. Now, what I've done is that when I click on the save button, this save changes method will be called. And in the beginning of the method, I will loop through, or actually not loop, but go through the different tabs and remove that error indicator from the caption. So I'm basically resetting the status. So by default, I expect that everything is okay. And the next thing that I will do is for the field group, which I again call binder, I call get fields. It will return me a collection of all the fields that it has bound properties to. So now I get every field from all of these 3 tabs, not just one tab, but all of the fields that I have here. And then I start manually looping through each field, and I call validate for each field. If the validation fails, then an invalid value exception is thrown. And I will catch that validation exception. And if that exception occurs, then I will add an invalid value style name to the field. That's just a custom style name that I've defined. And in my CSS code, I've defined that, okay, if a field has invalid value style name, then it should have a red border.
Yes.
And then I have some code that will find out what is the tab for this particular field. So if this field fails, I find out, okay, this is the tab, and then I add the error indicator to the tab's caption.
Yes. And this is pretty much up to your own implementation. So here you could show the notification, you could show a splash screen, you could show whatever you want to do so.
We could do something like notification, show, get message, and let's put the type as error message. And note one thing that I left out, that if the validation passes, then we will call remove style name for the field. So it might be that a field already had it from a previous validation. So now we're just making sure that we're removing it so that it's not showing error. Yeah. Okay, so I now also added a notification that will show you the actual message for the failure. So when I click on save, okay, I think we have a deployment issue, so let's try again. Yeah, of course.
You're using Spring Boot?
Yeah, Spring Boot, so I should execute the application from here. I'm still not that used to Spring Boot, so I'm doing the old ways.
Yeah.
Okay, now I should have it set up, and now let's try. Okay, this is the classical demo effect.
Well, still, I mean...
Still, the idea is that when the validation message is caught, then we can do something. I'll figure out what the problem is, and we'll put the answer to the forum.
And the source code will be available online as well after, at some point, so you can have a look at it yourself. But the main idea here still stands that you have a lot of control over how the validation is done, and or basically in this case, how to show the validation itself and validation errors.
Yeah, and actually this wasn't all that we had to do. There's one more thing that we need to do, and that's to disable the default validation. So now if I wouldn't do this, then we would also get the normal validation error. So in my case, I don't want to have that at all. So I'll completely disable that and handle the validation myself. So basically, after I've looped through all of these fields, I will call commit, so which will actually then commit the changes from the different forms to the underlying item if all the validations pass. Okay, so that's that, and then I had a third example. So CrossField Validation. This doesn't actually have anything to do with field groups, but it's something that comes up when you use field groups. So I prepared an example. Here I have the address, and let's say that we have a use case that the user should add an address, and either it can be completely empty, or if the user adds something, then he has to add all the details. So basically it means that if you don't want to put your address, that's fine, but if you enter your street name, then you also have to add the zip code and city. So now if I enter something here, we can see that the validation fails for all of these three fields. Now, how this is implemented is through a custom validator. So I prepared a dependent validator. So this implements the validator interface, which has just one method, validate, which gets an object value. And if the validation fails, we should throw an invalid value exception. And how validators are designed is that it gets one value, and then we should validate that value. But now when we're doing cross-field validations, we're not relying on just one value. We're actually going to need values from all the three fields. So in my case, I'm not even using this value for anything. Rather, I have to register which fields I'm going to validate. So I have here an add dependent field method, which then puts the field to a list. And what I do when we call on validate is loop through all the fields and check that does it have a value.
Yeah.
And if it has a value, then this validation will fail if there is a field that doesn't have a value.
Yeah.
So basically we check that all the fields have a value or none of them have. If there is some that has a value but some that doesn't, then we'll throw an exception.
Yeah.
And then we also bind this validator to all these three fields.
Yeah.
So basically now if I add a value to all of those three, then the validation will pass.
Yeah. Quite a typical case, I guess, would be, if you go back to the source code again, would be to catch the invalid value exception and show that on the screen, for instance.
Yes, that's correct. Note that this doesn't necessarily work out of the box. It depends on how you are actually changing or how you're doing the validation and how you're showing the validation messages. Yeah. So now if I wouldn't be using this custom style of showing validation failures, so these red borders, and I would just rely on the normal error indicator, I wouldn't necessarily get these to fail, because in order to get those error indicators to show here, we have to have something that has changed in the field itself in order to the state being updated on the client side. And in my case, the state is updated when I apply the style name. Right. So if I wouldn't apply the style name here, it might be working in a bit different way. Yeah. But what I could do is here in the loop, when something fails, I could mark all of the fields as dirty, which will tell the framework that, hey, okay, there have been some changes and I need to update the state.
Yeah. And of course, that's your implementation of the validator, so it could be something more advanced or even easier as well. So
yeah, that's
another typical use case is that if you put in the country you live in and then the phone number has to be of an some certain format and so
yeah,
forth.
Or you put in the country and you also have to specify a state if you're in the US or something like that. Yeah. So it's completely up to you what you want to do in your application.
Yeah.
Okay, that was all that I wanted to show. So now, do we have any questions?
Let's see. We had 3 kinds of questions that we already answered. A lot of you asked the same questions. We will be on the forum itself and answering the questions afterwards as well. We'll be posting the source code to this one, and the video itself is available online for you to view after this one as well. So please share it and share with your friends.
Yeah. There was one question about a person who was using a bean field group, and he explained that he had a person object and he binds that person object to a bean field group. Basically, a bean field group is exactly the same as a field group, but it's optimized for handling beans. So instead of creating a bean item, you can give the bean itself directly to the bean field group, and it will internally create the item and get the properties, and it will also automatically bind bean validators if we have bean validation annotations defined on the bean itself.
Yeah.
So his question was that I have a person bean and I have bound it to a bean field group, and when he changes the value of name in the person object, those changes are not immediately seen in the form. So the content of the form is not updated, and the question was why. Well, the answer is that Vaadin doesn't know that you have changed the value. So if you call set name on your person object, there is no event or trigger going on to Vaadin that, hey, the value has changed. So basically you have to somehow tell the field group that, hey, now you need to re-render the content because the bean itself has changed. So one way would be to reset the item data source to the field group. Yeah. So then that's a trigger for Vaadin to re-render the content and fetch the data again from the bean. Are there any other questions?
There aren't any new ones that have come up.
Okay.
So I guess that's it. So if you have some other questions, just post them on the forum. Also, please remember to check out vaadin.com. On the main page, there's the calendar about next upcoming events. Next week we have a webinar about LifeRay, and together with guys from LifeRay and Vaadin here in the studio. And also there are trainings coming up every now and then around the world, so they're all available on vaadin.com/training, or just look at the agenda on the main page. And yeah, I guess that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
See
for
you
joining.
next week. Thank you.